The morning sun cast long shadows across the ornate gardens of Buckingham Palace as King Charles III stood at his office window, watching the gardeners tend to the rose bushes that had been his mother's pride and joy. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, as he clutched a manila folder containing documents that would change everything. Camilla entered the room quietly, her silk dress rustling against the Persian carpet. She had been his companion through decades of scandal, public scrutiny, and personal turmoil. From their secret meetings in the countryside to their eventual marriage, she had stood by his side when the world seemed against them. But today, something was different in the air between them. "Charles, you've been standing there for an hour," she said softly, approaching him with the careful steps of someone who sensed danger. "The Prime Minister is waiting for your call about the Commonwealth Summit." He turned to face her, and she immediately noticed the strain in his eyes. The man who had waited 70 years to become king now looked as though the burden might crush him. His usually perfect posture seemed slightly bent, as if carrying an invisible weight. "Camilla, we need to talk," he said, his voice carrying an edge she had rarely heard before. "Please sit down." She remained standing, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Years of royal training had taught her to read the subtle signs of crisis, and every instinct told her that this conversation would not end well. "Is this about the press again?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Because we've weathered worse storms than this. Remember when they called me the most hated woman in Britain? We survived that together." Charles walked to his mahogany desk, the same one his mother had used for decades. Family photographs lined its surface, pictures of William and Harry as children, formal portraits from state occasions, and, tucked behind them all, a small framed photo of him and Camilla from their wedding day. His fingers traced the edge of the manila folder. "This isn't about the press," he said quietly. "This is about choices I made years ago that I can no longer live with. Choices that compromise everything I swore to uphold when I took the throne." Camilla's face went pale. She had seen Charles in many states over their long relationship, angry, frustrated, heartbroken, triumphant. But she had never seen him look so resolute about something that clearly caused him pain. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, though part of her already knew. He opened the folder and spread several documents across the desk. Bank statements, property deeds, correspondence with foreign officials, papers that told a story of financial arrangements that had been hidden from public view for years. Some bore her signature alongside his. "The investigation into our private finances has uncovered things that I thought would never see the light of day," Charles said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Arrangements that were made during my time as Prince of Wales, investments that benefited us personally while I was receiving public funding." Camilla moved closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the documents. She recognized her own handwriting on several of them, signatures she had given without question, trusting Charles completely with their joint financial decisions. "But these were all legal," she protested. "Your advisors assured us everything was above board. We paid taxes on everything." "Legal, yes," Charles replied. "But ethical, honorable, worthy of a king who is supposed to be above reproach." He shook his head. "The public is already questioning the monarchy's relevance. When these documents become public, and they will, it will be the final blow to the institution my mother spent 70 years protecting." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock that had belonged to King George VI. Camilla sank into the chair she had refused earlier, her legs suddenly, unable to support her. "So what are you saying?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Charles straightened his shoulders, and, for a moment, he looked every inch the king he had become. "I'm saying that I have to choose between the crown and everything else. And I've made my choice." Camilla's eyes filled with tears as the full meaning of his words hit her. After everything they had been through, after fighting the world for their right to be together, he was choosing duty over love. Again. "Charles, please," she began. But he held up his hand to stop her. "The Prime Minister will announce tomorrow that I am taking full responsibility for these financial irregularities. I will be making a substantial payment to the Treasury to cover any questionable benefits we received." And he paused, struggling with the words, "I will be stepping back from all public duties pending a full investigation." "And me?" Camilla asked, her voice barely audible. Charles looked at her with eyes full of regret and something that looked almost like relief. "You have a choice, Camilla. You can stand by me through this scandal, knowing that it will likely destroy both of us in the public eye. Or," he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The unspoken alternative hung in the air between them, like a sword waiting to fall. Camilla could distance herself from the scandal, claim ignorance of the financial arrangements, and potentially save her own reputation. The woman who had once been described as the other woman in the century's most famous love triangle now faced the most difficult decision of her life. Everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed, everything she had endured, it all came down to this moment in a sunlit room overlooking the gardens where she had finally found acceptance. "I need time to think," she said finally, rising from her chair on unsteady legs. "Of course," Charles replied, though his voice betrayed his disappointment. "But, Camilla, you should know, whatever you decide, I don't blame you. We both knew this day might come. We just hoped it wouldn't." As she walked toward the door, Camilla turned back one last time. The man she had loved for decades stood silhouetted against the window, looking older and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. The crown that had always stood between them had finally won. "I'll give you my answer tonight," she said. And then she was gone, leaving Charles alone with the weight of his decision and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Camilla walked through the palace corridors like a ghost, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. She passed portraits of queens and kings who had faced their own impossible choices, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she made her way to her private sitting room. The room had been her sanctuary since becoming queen consort. She had decorated it herself with comfortable furniture and personal photographs, creating a space that felt more like home than palace. Now, as she closed the door behind her, it felt like a prison. She poured herself a cup of tea from the service that sat perpetually ready on the side table, her hands shaking slightly as she lifted the delicate porcelain cup. Through the tall windows, she could see tourists gathered outside the palace gates, their cameras ready to capture any glimpse of royal life. If only they knew what was really happening behind these walls. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Laura. "Mom, saw the morning news. Everything okay? Call me." Even her children could sense that something was wrong. The press had been sniffing around for weeks, asking questions about finances and investments that had seemed innocent at the time, but now felt like daggers pointed at the heart of the monarchy. Camilla thought back to the early days with Charles, when their relationship had been conducted in secret, stolen moments between his official duties and her life as a divorced mother. She remembered the pain of watching him marry Diana, the years of being portrayed as the villain in a fairy tale gone wrong, the slow and difficult journey to public acceptance. When they had finally married in 2005, she thought the worst was behind them. The public had begun to warm to her, appreciating her down-to-earth nature and her devotion to Charles. She had thrown herself into royal duties, supporting dozens of charities and causes close to her heart. She had even begun to enjoy the pomp and ceremony that came with royal life. But now, sitting in her sanctuary, she realized that all of it could disappear overnight. The financial arrangements that Charles was so worried about had seemed routine when they were made. His advisors had assured them that everything was legal, that as Prince of Wales, Charles was entitled to make certain investments and arrangements. She had signed the papers because she trusted him completely. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see one of her ladies-in-waiting. Instead, it was William who entered, his face grave with concern. The future king looked so much like his father at that age that it took her breath away for a moment. "Camilla," he said, using the informal name he had eventually grown comfortable with after years of awkwardness. "Father told me about the situation. I wanted to speak with you before you make any decisions." She gestured for him to sit across from her, noting how he chose his words carefully. Even in private, William was always mindful of his position and responsibilities. "What did he tell you exactly?" she asked, curious about how much Charles had revealed to his son. "Enough to know that you're both facing an impossible situation," William replied. "But I want you to know that whatever happened with those financial arrangements, I don't believe for a moment that either of you intended any wrongdoing." Camilla felt tears prick at her eyes. William's support meant more than he could know. Their relationship had taken years to develop, moving from polite tolerance to genuine affection, and his words carried weight that went beyond royal protocol. "But it doesn't matter what we intended, does it?" she said quietly. "The public will see what they want to see. They'll remember every terrible thing that was ever written about me, every accusation, every cruel cartoon. I'll become the woman who brought down the monarchy. Or," William said, leaning forward with intensity, "you could be the woman who stood by her husband when he needed her most. The woman who showed that love and loyalty still means something in this world. Camilla studied his face, seeing not just the future king but the young boy who had lost his mother so tragically. She thought about Harry, thousands of miles away in America, probably unaware of the crisis unfolding at home. She thought about her own children and grandchildren, who would have to live with whatever decision she made. "What would you do, William?" she asked. "If you were in my position?" He was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the weight of her question. "I would ask myself whether I could live with abandoning the person I love when they needed me most," he said finally. "But I would also ask whether staying might cause even more harm to the institution we're all sworn to protect." After William left, Camilla found herself wandering the palace like a lost soul. She walked past the throne room where she had stood beside Charles during his coronation, remembering the moment when the crown was placed on his head, and she had felt such pride and hope for their future together. She visited the library where they had spent quiet evenings reading together, Charles often sharing passages from his favorite books about philosophy and architecture. She stood in the music room where they had hosted intimate concerts for friends and family, Charles sometimes playing the cello while she listened with genuine admiration. Every room held memories of the life they had built together, a life that had taken decades to achieve and could be destroyed in a matter of days. Her phone rang, displaying her sister's number. Annabelle had always been her closest confidant, the one person who could speak to her without any royal protocol. "Camilla, darling, I just heard the most awful rumors," Annabelle said without preamble. "Please tell me it's not as bad as they're saying." "It's worse," Camilla replied, her voice cracking for the first time that day. "And I have to decide whether to save myself or go down with the ship." "Oh, my dear," Annabelle said softly. "You know what our mother would have said." Camilla did know. Their mother had been a woman of unshakable principles who believed that loyalty was the highest virtue. She had stood by their father through his business failures and health problems, never once considering abandoning him when times got tough. But their mother had never faced anything like this. She had never been thrust into the global spotlight, never had to consider the fate of an ancient institution that millions of people around the world looked to for stability and continuity. As evening approached, Camilla made one final stop in her journey through the palace. She went to Charles's private study, where she knew he would be waiting for her answer. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see him sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply observe the man she had loved for so long. He looked exhausted, aged by the weight of his responsibilities and the impossible choice he had been forced to make. This was the man who had given up so much to be with her, who had faced down public disapproval and family pressure to marry her. Now he was asking her to make the same sacrifice he had made so many times before, to choose duty over personal happiness, to put the greater good above their own desires. Camilla took a deep breath and knocked on the door frame. Charles looked up, his eyes searching her face for any hint of her decision. "I've made my choice," she said, stepping into the room that would determine both their fates. The weight of centuries seemed to press down on them both as she prepared to speak the words that would change everything forever. Charles rose from his chair as Camilla entered the study, his movements careful and deliberate like those of a man walking to his own execution. The lamplight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look older than his years. He had spent the afternoon preparing for both possibilities, her decision to stand by him or her choice to save herself. "Sit down, Charles," Camilla said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please." He remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in the military posture that had become second nature over decades of public appearances. "I need to stand for this," he replied. "Whatever you've decided, I need to face it properly." Camilla moved to the window that overlooked the palace courtyard, where the changing of the guard would take place tomorrow morning as it had for generations. Tourists would gather to watch the ceremony, taking photographs and marveling at the pageantry, never knowing that the monarchy itself might be crumbling behind the ornate facades. "I've been thinking about your mother," she said, not yet ready to reveal her decision. "About what you would have done in this situation." Charles's expression softened slightly at the mention of Elizabeth II. "She would have put duty before everything else," he said. "She always did, even when it broke her heart." "Yes," Camilla agreed. "But she also understood love. Real love. She knew what it meant to choose someone and stick by them no matter what the world threw at you." The reference to his mother's long and devoted marriage to Prince Philip hung in the air between them. Elizabeth and Philip had weathered their own storms, their own scandals and difficulties, but they had remained united until the end. This is different, Charles said firmly. My mother never faced anything that could have destroyed the monarchy itself. The institution was never at risk because of her personal choices. Camilla turned from the window to face him directly. Wasn't it? Remember the abdication crisis? Your great-uncle gave up the throne for love, and everyone said it would destroy the royal family. But your grandfather stepped up, your mother became queen earlier than anyone expected, and the monarchy survived. It adapted. That's not the same thing, Charles protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis. He didn't drag the crown through a financial scandal. No, Camilla said, stepping closer to him. He just abandoned his duty completely. At least you're trying to find a way to serve both the crown and your conscience. Charles looked at her with surprise. He had expected her to argue for self-preservation, to distance herself from his troubles as any rational person would do. Instead, she seemed to be arguing for something else entirely. Camilla, what are you saying? She reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I spent the afternoon writing a statement, she said, holding it out to him. 2 statements, actually. Charles took the papers with trembling hands. The first was exactly what he had expected. A carefully worded announcement that Camilla had been unaware of the financial arrangements, that she had signed documents without fully understanding their implications, and that she would be stepping back from royal duties to avoid any appearance of impropriety. The second statement made his breath catch in his throat. It was a declaration of her complete support for Charles, an acknowledgement of her involvement in the financial decisions, and a commitment to face whatever consequences came together. But, more than that, it was a call for the monarchy to be more transparent and accountable, to modernize its practices and prove its relevance to a new generation. I don't understand, Charles said, looking up from the papers. Which one did you choose? Neither, Camilla said, surprising him again. I wrote them both to help me understand what I really believed. And what I realized is that both options are based on fear, fear of the press, fear of public opinion, fear of change. She moved to stand beside him, looking down at the documents that had started this whole crisis. Charles, you've spent your entire life preparing to be king. You've studied history, philosophy, religion. You understand better than anyone that institutions either evolve or they die. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that instead of trying to hide this scandal or distance ourselves from it, we face it head on, she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. We admit our mistakes, we make our restitution, and we use this crisis as an opportunity to show that the monarchy can be honest about its failures and still serve the British people. Charles stared at her as if she had suggested they abolish the monarchy entirely. Camilla, you don't understand what you're asking. The press will tear us apart. The public will lose all faith in the institution. Or, she countered, they might respect us for telling the truth. People are tired of politicians and leaders who never admit fault, who blame others for their mistakes. Maybe it's time for the monarchy to show some genuine humility. She took the papers from his hands and set them aside. I've made my decision, Charles. I'm staying. Not because I'm choosing between my reputation and yours, but because I believe we can do this right. Together. The relief that flooded Charles's face was immediately followed by fear. You don't know what you're risking, he said. Your children, your grandchildren, they'll all be affected by this. The press will bring up every old story, every criticism that was ever made about you. Let them, Camilla said with a strength that surprised even her. I'm 76 years old, Charles. I've been through worse things than bad press. And our children are stronger than you think. They'll understand that sometimes you have to take a stand for what's right, even when it's difficult. Charles reached for her hands, holding them tightly as if she might disappear if he let go. Are you absolutely certain? Because once we announce this together, there's no going back. We'll either survive this as a team or we'll fall together. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Camilla said, and she meant it. All the doubt and fear that had plagued her throughout the day had crystallized into a clear sense of purpose. Besides, do you really think I would abandon you now? After everything we've been through? Charles pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if she were the most precious thing in the world. For a moment, they stood together in the quiet study, surrounded by the books and papers that represented centuries of royal history, knowing that they were about to add their own chapter to that complicated legacy. There's something else, Camilla said, pulling back to look at him. I want to propose that we establish a new foundation focused on financial transparency and accountability, not just for the royal family, but for all public institutions. We can turn this scandal into something positive. Charles looked at her with amazement. You want to make this scandal the basis for a new charitable foundation? Why not? She said with a smile that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her all those years ago. If we're going to face the music, we might as well conduct the orchestra. As the evening deepened outside the palace windows, Charles and Camilla began to plan their strategy. They would call William and Kate, Harry and Meghan, and all the senior royals. They would meet with the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury. They would craft a statement that would shock the nation with its honesty and hopefully begin the process of rebuilding trust. It would be the most difficult thing either of them had ever done, but they would do it together. The final tie that Charles had been preparing to cut, the bond between love and duty that had tormented him his entire life, would remain intact after all. But as they prepared to face their future together, neither of them could have predicted the emotional toll that their decision would take, or the unexpected source of opposition that would emerge from within their own family. The next morning brought an unseasonable chill to London, as if the weather itself was responding to the tension within the palace walls. Charles and Camilla had barely slept, spending most of the night refining their strategy and preparing for the most difficult day of their lives together. At 8 o'clock sharp, they met with Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's private secretary, and a small team of senior advisors in the blue drawing room. The ornate chamber, with its priceless artwork and gilded furniture, seemed to mock the gravity of their situation. Here they were, surrounded by centuries of royal wealth and privilege, preparing to confess to financial improprieties. Your Majesties, Sir Clive began, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain, I must advise you one final time that this course of action is unprecedented and extremely risky. We have prepared alternative statements that would minimize the damage to both the crown and your personal reputations. Charles sat straighter in his chair, every inch the king despite the crisis swirling around him. Sir Clive, I appreciate your counsel, but our decision is final. We will face this together, with complete honesty about our mistakes and our commitment to making amends. Camilla squeezed Charles's hand under the table. They had agreed that she would let him take the lead in these formal meetings, but her presence beside him spoke volumes about their united front. The palace's communications director, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Thornberry, cleared her throat. Sir, the press is already gathering outside in unusual numbers. We're getting calls from every major news organization asking about rumors of a major announcement. Good, Camilla said, speaking for the first time. Let them gather. When we're ready to speak, we want to make sure everyone hears what we have to say. At 10 o'clock, William and Kate arrived for what the schedule euphemistically called a family meeting. Catherine looked particularly tense, her usual composed public demeanor replaced by genuine concern for the family she had married into. William's face was unreadable, a skill he had learned from years of managing his emotions under public scrutiny. Father, William said as they settled into the morning room. Kate and I have been discussing this situation all night. We want to understand exactly what you're planning to announce. Charles looked at his eldest son, seeing not just the future king but the boy who had endured the loss of his mother in the most public way possible. We're going to tell the truth, William. All of it. The financial arrangements, the mistakes in judgment, the restitution we're making to the treasury. Kate spoke up, her voice careful but firm. With respect, Your Majesty, have you considered the impact this will have on George, Charlotte, and Louis? They're already dealing with the pressures of being royal children. This kind of scandal could follow them for the rest of their lives. The mention of his grandchildren hit Charles like a physical blow. He had been so focused on doing what he believed was right that he hadn't fully considered the long-term consequences for the youngest members of the family. Camilla watched Charles struggle with this new dimension of their decision. She could see him wavering for the first time since they had committed to their course of action. Kate's right to be concerned about the children, Camilla said gently. But wouldn't it be worse for them to grow up in a monarchy built on secrets and half-truths? At least this way, they'll know that their grandfather was brave enough to admit his mistakes and work to fix them. William stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that mirrored his father perfectly. There's something else we need to discuss, he said without turning around. Harry called me this morning. The room fell silent. Harry's relationship with the family had been strained since his departure from royal duties, and his communications with his father and stepmother had been minimal at best. What did he say? Charles asked, though his tone suggested he was bracing for bad news. He's flying back to London. William said, finally, turning to face them. He says he needs to be here for this, whether we want him here or not. But he also wanted me to tell you that he supports what you're doing completely. Charles felt tears prick at his eyes. Despite all their disagreements and misunderstandings, his younger son was coming home to stand with the family during their darkest hour. There's more, William continued. Harry says that he and Meghan want to make their own statement supporting your decision. They're calling it an act of courage and saying it's exactly the kind of leadership the monarchy needs. Camilla felt a surge of unexpected emotion at this news. Harry's approval meant more than she had realized it would. Their relationship had been complicated from the beginning, shaped by his grief over his mother's death and his struggle to accept his father's new wife. But, in this moment, his support felt like a gift. The afternoon brought a series of increasingly tense meetings with government officials. The Prime Minister arrived at 2 o'clock, his face grave with the knowledge that a royal scandal could destabilize his own government at a particularly delicate time. Your Majesty, the Prime Minister said, settling into a chair across from Charles in the 1844 room. I must express my profound concern about this proposed course of action. The monarchy's stability is crucial to our constitutional framework. Any damage to the crown could have far-reaching political consequences. Charles had expected this argument, but it still stung to hear it stated so bluntly. Prime Minister, with respect, I believe the monarchy's credibility will be more damaged by attempting to cover up these mistakes than by honestly acknowledging them. But, sir, the Prime Minister pressed, once you admit wrongdoing, regardless of your intentions, it opens the door for republicanism to gain ground. There are already voices calling for the abolition of the monarchy. This could give them the ammunition they need. Camilla watched Charles wrestle with this argument. The threat to the institution he had sworn to protect was real and immediate. But she also knew that his integrity wouldn't allow him to build his reign on a foundation of hidden truths. Prime Minister, she said, drawing surprised looks from the assembled officials who weren't used to the Queen Consort taking such an active role in these discussions. Don't you think the British people are intelligent enough to distinguish between honest mistakes and deliberate corruption? Don't they deserve leaders who trust them with the truth? The Prime Minister studied her carefully, as if seeing her in a new light. Your Majesty, I don't doubt the intelligence of the British people, but I do question whether they're prepared for this level of transparency from the royal family. By evening, word of the impending announcement had leaked to the press, though the details remained unclear. The palace switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from journalists around the world, all clamoring for confirmation of rumors that ranged from a royal divorce to Charles's abdication. Charles and Camilla sat together in their private sitting room, watching the news coverage with a mixture of anxiety and fascination. Sky News was running constant updates, with royal correspondents speculating wildly about what the morning's announcement might contain. Are you having second thoughts? Charles asked, noticing how quiet Camilla had become as they watched their lives being dissected on television. She turned to look at him, this man who had chosen love over duty so many times in his life, and who was now trying to choose both. No, she said firmly. But I am scared. Not of what people will say about us, but of what happens if we're wrong. What if this really does damage the monarchy beyond repair? Charles took her hand, feeling the wedding ring he had placed there nearly 20 years ago. Then, we'll face that consequence together, he said. But, Camilla, I truly believe that honesty and transparency are the only things that can save the monarchy in the long run. People don't expect their leaders to be perfect, but they do expect them to be truthful. At midnight, as they prepared to face the most challenging day of their public life together, Charles and Camilla made one final review of the statement they would deliver to the nation. It was longer than traditional royal announcements, more personal, and revealing than anything the monarchy had ever attempted. But, as they read through the words that would change everything, both of them felt a sense of peace that had been missing for weeks. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it with their integrity intact, and their love for each other stronger than ever. The final tie that had seemed so close to breaking had instead become the bond that would carry them through their greatest test yet. But neither of them could have anticipated the emotional breakdown that would occur when Camilla faced the reality of what their decision truly meant for her future and the future of the family she had fought so hard to join. The morning of the announcement dawned gray and drizzly, as if London itself was mourning what was about to unfold. Charles woke before 5, as he had done every day since becoming king. But this morning felt different. Today, he would either save the monarchy through radical honesty or deliver it a blow from which it might never recover. Camilla was already awake beside him, staring at the ceiling with the kind of stillness that comes from a sleepless night spent in deep thought. They had been through many challenges together, but nothing had prepared them for the weight of this moment. "Charles," she said quietly, not looking at him, "I need to tell you something before we do this." He turned to face her, immediately alert to the strain in her voice. "What is it?" For the first time since making their decision, Camilla's composure began to crack. "I'm terrified," she whispered, and her voice broke slightly on the words. "Not of the press, not of public opinion, but of what this means for us. For our marriage. For everything we've built together." Charles reached for her, but she sat up and moved to the edge of the bed, her back to him. "What if we're wrong, Charles? What if this destroys everything? And in 5 years we're looking back wondering why we threw it all away for the sake of principle?" He sat up as well, his heart breaking at the pain in her voice. "Camilla, look at me." She turned, and he saw tears streaming down her face. This was the woman who had faced down decades of public hatred with dignity, who had stood beside him through every crisis, who had seemed unshakable even yesterday. Now she looked fragile and frightened. "I keep thinking about your mother," she said through her tears, "about how she never put a foot wrong in 70 years. And here we are, about to confess to financial impropriety on national television. What if history remembers us as the couple who brought down the British monarchy?" Charles moved to sit beside her, pulling her into his arms as she sobbed against his shoulder. "Darling, do you remember what you told me when we decided to get married? When everyone said it would be a disaster for the monarchy?" She nodded, unable to speak. "You said that love was worth the risk, that we couldn't live our lives based on what other people thought was right for us." He lifted her chin to look at her. "This is the same thing, Camilla. We're choosing to do what we believe is right, regardless of the consequences." "But marriage was about us," she protested. "This affects millions of people. The Commonwealth realms, the British people, generations of future royals. How can we make a decision this enormous based on what we think is right?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, understanding for the first time the full weight of what they were about to do. "Because that's what leadership means," he said finally. "Making the hard choices that others can't or won't make. My mother understood that. She made difficult decisions her entire reign, often at great personal cost." At 7 o'clock, Harry arrived at the palace, looking haggard from his overnight flight, but determined to be present for his family's crisis. Charles and Camilla met him in the private dining room, where breakfast sat untouched on the sideboard. "Dad," Harry said, embracing his father with an intensity that spoke of years of unresolved emotion. "Stepmother," he said to Camilla, using the formal title they had eventually settled on but saying it with genuine warmth. "Harry," Camilla said, fresh tears threatening as she hugged her stepson. "I can't believe you came all this way." "Of course I came," he replied. "This family sticks together when it matters. We've learned that the hard way." The three of them sat together, and, for the first time in years, Charles felt like they might actually be a family again. Harry's presence seemed to give Camilla strength, reminding her that their choices affected real people who cared about them. "I want you to know," Harry said, looking directly at Camilla, "that what you're doing today takes more courage than anything I've ever seen. You could have walked away, saved yourself, and no one would have blamed you. But you're standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Camilla dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. "I'm not feeling very brave right now," she admitted. "Brave people are always scared," Harry replied with a smile that reminded her of Diana's warmth. "That's what makes them brave." At 9 o'clock, the family gathered in the blue drawing room for a final meeting before the announcement. William and Kate had arrived with the children, who had been told only that Grandpa Charles had something important to say to the country. George, at 12, seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, while Charlotte and Louis were more interested in exploring the palace rooms they rarely got to visit. "Whatever happens after today," William said, addressing both Charles and Camilla, "I want you to know that Kate and I support you completely. We may have had reservations, but we understand why you're doing this. And we'll stand with you through whatever comes next." Kate nodded her agreement. "The children will be proud of their grandfather when they're old enough to understand what he did today." At 11 o'clock, Charles and Camilla walked hand in hand through the palace corridors toward the room where they would deliver their statement to the nation. Palace staff lined their route, many of them people who had served the royal family for decades. Some looked worried, others seemed proud, but all of them watched with the kind of attention reserved for historic moments. In the white drawing room, television cameras and lights had been set up for the broadcast. Charles and Camilla would sit together at a small table, with the joint statement spread before them. No podium, no formal regalia, just two people prepared to tell their truth to the world. As they took their seats, Camilla felt a moment of pure panic. The magnitude of what they were about to do hit her like a wave, and, for a second, she thought she might not be able to go through with it. The cameras would broadcast their words to millions of people around the world. There would be no taking it back, no spinning the narrative, no royal mystery to hide behind. Charles must have sensed her moment of doubt because he reached under the table and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. She looked at him, this man who had waited 70 years to be king and was now risking everything for the sake of honesty, and her panic subsided. "Your Majesties," the director said quietly, "we're live in 30 seconds. Camilla took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera. In a few moments, she would no longer be the queen consort who had struggled for acceptance. She would be a woman who had chosen love and integrity over safety and reputation. Whatever happened next, she would face it as herself, completely and honestly. The red light on the camera flashed on, and Charles began to speak. "My fellow citizens of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms, I speak to you today with my wife Camilla to address matters that affect both our personal integrity and the future of the monarchy we serve." As Charles continued with their carefully prepared statement, acknowledging their financial mistakes and announcing the formation of a new transparency foundation, Camilla felt something unexpected: peace. Yes, she was scared about the future, worried about the consequences of their decision. But she was no longer torn between competing loyalties. She had chosen love over safety, truth over comfort, courage over convenience. The final tie that might have been cut, the bond between Charles and Camilla that had survived so much, had instead become the foundation for a new kind of royal leadership. When Charles finished speaking and looked at her to deliver her own portion of the statement, Camilla spoke directly to the camera with a clarity and strength that surprised even her. "I know that many of you have questioned whether I belong in this role, whether someone like me should be your queen consort. Today, I hope to show you that belonging isn't about perfection. It's about being willing to admit our mistakes, learn from them, and work every day to be worthy of the trust you place in us." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "My husband and I have made errors in judgment. We've let you down. But we believe that acknowledging our failures honestly is the first step toward rebuilding the trust between the monarchy and the people we serve." As the broadcast concluded and the cameras were turned off, Charles and Camilla sat quietly for a moment, still holding hands. They had done it. They had chosen the most difficult path possible, but they had chosen it together. Whatever the future brought, criticism, calls for abdication, constitutional crisis, or perhaps, eventually, a new kind of respect for their honesty, they would face it as partners who had refused to let fear or convention break the bond between them. The final tie had not been cut after all. Instead, it had been strengthened in the fire of the most difficult decision of their lives together. And somewhere in the palace halls that had witnessed so much royal drama over the centuries, Camilla's tears were no longer tears of fear and desperation. They were tears of relief, of love, and of hope for a future they would build together, whatever it might bring.